Did you know the Surgeon General came out and said that smoking is healthier than being lonely? We talk about that as well as Josh Hawley and manbox culture in this week's episode. Welcome to the Ask a Matchmaker podcast. I'm your host, Matchmaker Maria. This week's guest is someone that I stalked after reading about him in the Washington Post, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mark Greene. Let me read you a little bit about Mark Greene. So Mark Greene writes, speaks, coaches, and consults on the challenges we face as men, women, and non-binary people impacted by our dominance-based culture of masculinity. He is the author of the little #MeToo book for men and co-author with Dr. Saliha Bava of the newly released The Relational Workplace. I am so happy to have you here, Mark. Welcome to the Ask a Matchmaker podcast.
Thank you. When anyone reads my little bio, I think, my God, that's a mouthful of words all coming together. But I hope we can dive into a little bit of what I mean by all of that and get a sense of it.
That article that made me, first of all, learn about you, and then the catalyst that caused me to discover you was that Washington Post article and your work in men's work and understanding the culture of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
You called it out as toxic, and I just had to learn more about you. Went through your websites and all that stuff, which I will leave in the show notes. Mark, I've got stuff. I've got notes here. So first up, the culture of masculinity. I've never heard. I feel like when I've read your book after that, I remember thinking like, oh, Mark is articulating things I didn't have words for.
Yeah.
I always thought of it as like we live in a patriarchy. I never thought of it as the culture of masculinity. So what do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things I say in the opening of my book is that for most men, beginning in infancy, we are taught what it means to be a man by our parents, our brothers and sisters, by the kids in the neighborhood, by teachers, coaches, by television, by movies, by mass media. It is so ubiquitous, the messages we get about how to be a man, that it's the air we breathe, the water we swim in.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, what we're actually talking about is a culture of masculinity. That is a collective agreement on how men should be men. And our particular culture of masculinity is generations old, is driven by what we call the Act Like a Man box, which is a set of rules for how to be a man. And it is dominance-based. It's hierarchical, where men compete with each other, where men display power as a way to validate our masculinity. And we can go into all the implications of that for how men operate in personal relationships and professional relationships. But the culture of masculinity is, as it was from you, for most people, hidden. So when you talk to a man about masculinity, unless you specifically say, we need to look at the culture of masculinity who taught us everything we believe about being a man, he thinks you're talking to him about his own identity. And that makes men very defensive, right?
Okay.
So that's a piece of this. The culture of masculinity is extremely powerful. It's an agreement we have all made, which means we can shift it. We can make a new agreement. And that's the work that's ongoing for us. But also, men are very defensive about the subject of masculinity because there's no larger context in which they can examine what they learned.
In your book, you talk about manbox culture.
Yeah.
So is that, what you were just describing, where we have this idea? And when you say like our understanding of the culture of masculinity, are you talking about like 21st century? Are we talking about, America? Like which part of masculinity?
Western culture is primarily where my work resides, but there are versions of dominance-based masculine culture globally.
Okay.
When we talk about man-box culture, let's get a bigger picture here. Patriarchy, right?
Right.
That is the systems and structures which advantage men over women, which give men power over women.
Mm-hmm.
Within the constraints of that, there are systems which condition men to accept that as the only way to be a man, to have power over women, etc. Man-box culture was originally conceptualized by a guy named Paul Kivel in the early 1980s in California. He went around to high schools and asked boys, what are the rules for being a man? Simple question. And they all gave him the same answers.
Which was?
Things like don't show your emotions, be a breadwinner, never a caregiver, have power over women and girls, be heterosexual, not homosexual. If you're going to talk to other guys, talk about something simple like cars or, sports. Don't talk about anything deep ever. And it is these ideas about masculinity which drive boys and men into disconnection.
But how are, like, so you're talking about boys in the 80s, right?
We could go back further in
Oh, I'm
terms of
sure.
manbox culture, but it comes forward to the present.
Where do those boys in the 80s and previous generations and since then, of course, like, where do they learn that? Like, for instance, you just said, like, don't have deep conversations. The conversations are going to be about A, B, C, D. Where is that learned?
Right. It is a collective cultural understanding of masculinity. And it comes out of what was essentially trauma, deep trauma of the Great Depression, of the Second World War, of cultures and societies which said men must be tough, must be dominant, must be stoic in order to get through the challenges that our fathers and grandfathers had to face at that time. But it turns out that all of these coping mechanisms are also deeply isolating for men.
In your book, you mentioned bootstrap individualism.
Right.
Tell me more about that, because I feel like when I read that, it's no, like, mystery to the show that I am a Greek person, and that is definitely a part of my identity. And being Greek, or being Greek American, more accurately, you know, I've been raised in this kind of having 2 feet in both boxes, right? Like the American identity, the Greek identity. And the Greek identity, it's a very collectivist attitude in how we approach family problems, even a meal, right? It's always family style. It's never like your own plate. And then whenever I hear the word bootstrap, to me, that's like such an American word, right? Which is like, figure it out. You're doing it by yourself. You do it. And it's not just me hearing it. It's I feel like it's American culture, right? We see this even in our Congress. Our Congress people say the words bootstrap. So when I read that in your book, I was like, wait, is there a bootstrap individualism of masculinity?
Well, one of the rules I failed to mention that's part of manbox culture is never ask for help. So when we talk about this idea that men never show weakness, never show emotion, never ask for help, are always tough, that's inherent to this dominance-based culture of masculinity. Understand that when I talk about a hierarchical masculinity, a culture of hierarchy, it means that someone's at the top, someone's at the middle, someone's at the bottom. And men are always in competition to rise up that hierarchy, or they end up being victimized by the men above them. So it's toughness, it's stoicism, all that. The process by which this idea of bootstrap individualism has gotten worse, we have to understand that political influences in the world seek to exacerbate the isolating aspects of masculinity, seek to exacerbate the challenges that it creates culturally and socially to their advantage. So we have, since, I would say, and I'm going to go a little political here, since Ronald Reagan's presidency, been looking at drumbeat messaging from the Republican Party about this idea of pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right.
If you're an American and you work hard enough, you can succeed. This was put in place and repeatedly pushed out as political messaging as a way to attack social programs in America, as a way to define people who are on welfare, who are using social programs as weak or as lazy.
Right.
So we have these aspects of dominance-based masculinity, which then get weaponized politically. And right now, we have a whole new push by Republicans. Josh Hawley, the senator, has just put out a book about masculinity, and all he's doing is harking back to these earlier ideas, retrogressive ideas of masculinity, which we know are problematic in the workplace.
What is he saying?
He's talking about everything.
I'm never going to read it,
defines.
so you have to. And I don't think a lot of my listeners are ever going to read it. So you're going to have to give us the show notes here.
Understand that he wants men to be men and women to be women. He's reinforcing the idea that there's a single viable definition of masculinity: toughness.
Which is what?
Well, toughness, religion, taking care of your family.
Oh, is that why he ran across the halls when January 6th protesters came in?
He did a little bit of scampering, but this is the challenge with a guy like Hawley, is that he is attempting to portray masculinity as a single definition, which is toughness, which is individualism, which is all of the, which is take care of your family, which is he's threaded religion into there. He's done this idea, and that women should be women, which is they should take care of the home, they should have children, they should look after their man, they should be subservient. This is nothing new to women. They've been hearing this story for decades.
Oh, yeah.
Men have been living into it for a long time, and now, shock and awe, women are saying, that's not such a good deal for us. Men are getting very angry and very reactive. Some are doing their work and growing and understanding what real equity is. But folks on the far right are attempting to re-establish dominance of men over women.
But what do they gain from doing that?
What do they gain from doing that?
I mean, I guess there's like a lot of money. Like I look at people like Andrew Tate and I think to myself like, well, there must be a lot of money in parroting. I cannot believe that he believes
they don't
100%
know
of the
how to
things that he
have
says.
a human relationship. They can only feel comfortable in a relationship with a woman where they hold the economic and other power cards in that relationship. Primarily because, and this, we can go back into this understanding of what man box culture does to boys at an early age, but most of those men rely on transactional relationships, which is if I'm the breadwinner and I get you a house, a mortgage, whatever, then you owe me something back. And I want to trade for sex. I want to trade for your subservience. I want to do a transactional exchange because they can't do a human exchange. They can't actually connect on a human level because it's stripped away from us as boys by man box culture.
I feel like you're suddenly describing like another nuance to like, have you heard of this term weaponized incompetence? So basically, this is again from the world of TikTok. I keep hearing it, but essentially, many, and I've spoken to a few divorce lawyers too, and they've all said similar things that a lot of divorces, they tend to happen, an increase by, let's say, I'm just going to say in quick terms, like weaponized incompetence, where one of the people, and specifically the male side, doesn't want to participate in the home or the parenting. And I'm not saying necessarily cleaning the house or doing the dishes or anything like that, but it's like there have been examples that you see where, a woman woke up early, like a wife woke up early, did the breakfast, is starting to do the laundry, she's cleaning the house because his friends are coming over for the big game, right? And then he'll say stuff like she'll be upset, she'll be resentful, she'll be tired because she is.
Yeah.
And then he'll say, well, why don't you just ask me for help? And it's like, well, no, this is your house. You need to be human. Like, this is your home. You need to participate in the organization of it. Because if I now have to sit down and tell you, okay, what do I need help with? Well, if I have to explain it to you, it's just going to take me more time. It's like, for instance, someone going to a man going to the supermarket. I know we're talking heteronormatively, but just for these examples, right? A man going to the supermarket and asking the woman, what do I need to buy? Well, if she has to make the list for you, then she should just go shopping. And that's what, like, essentially what,
I wonder what it is about this whole conversation you're framing, which seems to indicate that a man can't tell if a toilet's dirty. Like, he can't look down and say, maybe I should wash that. Just so you know, in my relationship, I am the person who takes care of our home.
Okay.
My wife makes the lion's share of the money in our family. So I have taken on responsibility. Also, my son is from a previous marriage. He just turned 18, recently moved out. But for the last 14 years, I've been his primary caregiver. But I do all the housework, and I mean all the housework, including the toilet. And I will tell you that my experience of that, having chosen to take on that role,
right.
I do my consulting, I do my creative work, I do my writing, I do all the other things that I do, but I also am primary. Frankly, I don't know how my mother did it for 5 kids over the course of ultimately 40 years without going insane.
Okay, so thank you for teeing that sentence out. So I feel like one of the reasons why I was reading Dr. Earhorn's work about motherhood on ice, right? Why more women are choosing to postpone pregnancy and also doing it on their own. And one of the reasons she says is that because there's just not enough of emotionally available men. And I also think in what she's saying, adding to that, I think that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing for your house. And I live in an equitable house too. Whatever needs to get clean, whoever's there is going to clean it. Yeah. Okay. But I grew up in a house that wasn't like that.
Mhm.
And a lot of us did.
Sure.
Right. And you think about like, wow, my mom worked and she parented and she took care of the house. And when you have that environment, you have my generation, I'm an elder millennial who's grown up with, and I see Gen X women and millennial women and maybe early Gen Z people, although they've been raised by Gen X, I think for the most part. I could be wrong. You see this new generation of women, though, nonetheless, 42 and under, who are like, well, I know what it's like if I marry a guy who doesn't want to have an equitable household or doesn't want to respect my boundaries or cannot tell that I'm starting to grow resentment in this relationship because a lot of the responsibilities fall on me. And therefore, I'd rather wait for the right guy to come along. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Absolutely.
I think having that example as a woman.
My God, what else would you do if you had the choice? Absolutely. And I was going to say about my mother going crazy.
Right.
I know from doing this work for years that it's invisible. It's invisible work. Bless my wife, bless my son. They got used to it just happening. Just happening. Oh, it's clean again. Well, that's nice. Now I'm going to mess it all up, you know? So there's a degree to which that kind of work, which is caregiving, which is service work, is both a growth opportunity for me as a human being, much less a man. But it's also, you have to understand that when somebody says, hey, I'm going to bring in a lot of money, can you take care of the housework? And you make an agreement? That's very different than, hi, welcome to my house, now get to work. This assumption based on gender that that's how it's going to play out. And even worse, when women are working full-time and taking care of that stuff, I can well imagine it would be better to just wait. Let's just wait until we find somebody who understands what fairness is. Fundamental, basic human fairness.
Whew. A lot of things here. Okay, so you know, so now that we're talking about this, I want to. It's like I feel like there's this correlation where women are, their expectations are higher. I feel like, no, it's not higher. Excuse me. When the baseline is below the ground, right?
Their expectations are human. And by the way, Josh Hawley wants the women just to go back and do the housework and earn the money and whatever. When you ask what Josh Hawley is advocating for, that's what he's advocating for.
When has that ever existed? I feel like every time I hear people say like, oh, women, you know what? That's like, again, that goes back to, I was reading this incredible book about women's roles in medieval society. And there is this preconceived notion that like women just didn't work then. No, people were peasants, people were working the farms, people were mending the children, which is a thing. Like if you have like 18 children, that's 4 full-time jobs. I mean, you pay a nanny, you pay a daycare to take care of 18 kids, and now you're just one person. You're gathering the food, you're cooking, like you have a restaurant essentially at your house every day, right? But somehow these things that a woman is participating in, they're not considered jobs. And so then you have people like Josh Hawley who are like, oh, we need to go back to women not working. Okay, and what do you gain from this? I just don't.
The subtext, the subculture is trad wives, traditional wives, trad wives.
Right, yeah, I've seen that.
Which is linked to extremist religious groups. But let's just take a step back for a moment and talk about what it is about boys and men that make them want to become transactional in that way. I'm doing this, so you do that. I'll trade you this for that. The challenge that we face in a culture that says boys should not show their emotions from a very early age, and there's 2 very important pieces of research about disconnection for boys early. One is by Niobe Way, who wrote a book called Deep Secrets. The other is by Judy Chu, who wrote a book called When Boys Become Boys. But fundamentally, if I tell you, as a boy or a girl, non-binary, it doesn't matter who you are, if I say don't show your emotions, what I'm doing in that moment, and this is primarily the message to boys, is I'm cutting you off from the back and forth relating, the iterative process by which we form relationships. Because emotions don't emerge, like they don't just show up in me and I put it on a plate and hand it to you. They're created in the back and forth of relating. We may start off having a little bit of a disagreement and I feel a little bit frustrated, and then we talk it through a little bit and slowly I get a sense of appreciation for you, or I find some humor. These emotions are emerging in the process of relating. And we tell boys, don't show your emotions. We're cutting them off from the fundamental process, not only of creating relationships, but also learning how to express emotionally in nuanced ways. This is the trial and error work of becoming a fully realized, relational, emotionally expressive human. And we tell boys, never do that.
Right.
And this is why we end up with men who don't know how to express emotionally, who tend to give bursts of emotion as anger or frustration, and who have never learned to do the nuanced process of seeing difference. So speaking across difference, holding uncertainty, not collapsing into the emotions of others. This is all the work we do in men's work late in life because we didn't get to do it as young men. But we can instead create a container for our sons and daughters as parents to do that work. There's ways to create that for our children. But for men of my generation, most of us never had the chance to do it.
How much has that contributed to what the Surgeon General is now saying, the epidemic of loneliness?
Ground zero. It's ground zero.
What did he say? It's safer to smoke 15 cigarettes a day
Yep.
than to be lonely in America.
Loneliness, Cigna did a study, 2017. They found that 58% of people in America feel sometimes or always alone. And dominance-based masculine culture is a big driver for that. Because if you're a man and you're basically socially isolated, you only have a relationship with your wife, then you're going to be, by definition, isolating her as well, right? So we have an impact by dominance-based masculine culture. Also, we have men coming into their married relationships expecting women to take all of the emotional energy that they need to process. And this happens for some people when they're very young. Women are in no position to manage that level of emotional demands over and over again. Caregiving, holding space for men. But understand that this comes out of Niobe Way's research, right? So Niobe Way is a professor at NYU. She wrote a book called Deep Secrets. She went to boys in early adolescence and asked them a simple question. What does your best friend mean to you?
Okay.
And those boys said to her, they used the word love unashamedly. I love my best friend. And the other thing they said was, without my best friend, I would go crazy. So then
they were 5. How old were they?
They were probably 13,
Oh,
14.
okay.
Early adolescence.
Okay.
Right? And they're saying, my best friend, without him, I would go crazy. They had these deep, intimate, meaningful conversations. And I saw my own son engage in that at that age. But then a few years later, late adolescence, she goes back to the same boys. And she's been doing this research for decades. She said, and these boys say, yeah, my best friend, Mike, he lives around the corner, but I don't see him that much anymore. He's a great basketball player. No homo. They'll throw that in if they say anything nice about that boy. Another boy in her interview says, yeah, that friendship, it's kind of on a crossfade. It's kind of fading out. And when she dug deeper, what she found out is that by late adolescence, the drumbeat messages of our culture of masculinity had taught these boys that who they were authentically wasn't what they should be focusing on. What they should be doing is proving what they are not. And the 3 things they focus on proving they are not is little kids, girly, or gay. And accordingly, they let go of those relationships, which a few years before they'd said I'd go crazy without, and their suicide numbers become 4 times of that of girls their age. Now you take Judy Chu's research. She goes back to 4-year-old boys. She embeds herself in a pre-K class for 2 years and does a research project where she's there as part of the staff of that class. And what she discovers is that 4-year-old boys are already hiding their natural emotional acuity and taking on the stoic performance of masculinity the culture tries to teach them. A little boy comes up to her, as you can read it in her book, comes up to her at 4 years old, and he says, Mrs. Chu, I'm friends with all the girls, but don't tell Mike, the head of the boys club, because if he finds out I'm friends with the girls, he'll kick me out of the boys club and I won't have a club anymore.
So already cultural isolation.
There's 2 important notes there. One is this tone that we shouldn't be connecting across difference. So this little boy loses his opportunity to continue to be in dialogue with people who are very different. That might be across race. In this case, it's across gender. Huge skill sets get developed when you stay in those dialogues. But the other thing we really need to notice is that this little boy is already hiding authentic aspects of himself in order to fit in with what whoever the lead boy is, what his view of masculinity is. And this is where boys begin this process of becoming disconnected, lost to ourselves. We begin to hide aspects of ourselves as we age going forward that don't fit this narrow definition of masculinity, this brittle, narrow, dominance-based view of masculinity. And ultimately, the amount of stuff we hide defines the amount of anxiety we feel about it getting found out. So men end up being they get their connection in the world broken. They get slotted into this dominance-based hierarchy of masculinity where they're given their position based on their physical size, their family's wealth, their class, their status, race, whatever it is. And then they're basically told, learn to dominate the men around you or lose status.
I think when the Surgeon General came out and said, sound the alarm about loneliness.
Absolutely.
My immediate thought was like, well, if the government is getting involved, what are they going to do? Because, for instance, when the Surgeon General came out to say about like cigarettes, which is to me full circle right now, but when they said like we need to ban cigarettes, certain things happened. Taxes went up on cigarettes. People put a parameter around doors that you can't smoke within 10 feet of a door, right? You can't smoke in restaurants, which, by the way, I happened to be working like my of my first jobs when I was a teenager at Red Lobster. I was the hostess, and I started right when, like 2 months before that ban took place, where you like there was indoor smoking, and then there was no more indoor smoking. And watching that transition was just so amusing to me, because I remember thinking then, like, wow, I didn't smoke, but I remember thinking like, oh, at least now these people get to go outside and make a buddy. That was just a 16, 17-year-old thought, right? Which is like, I see this one dad going outside to smoke with some other dad from another table. Maybe they'll be friends. Maybe they'll go golfing on. This is just my thought.
Yeah.
And then when the Surgeon General's study came out, I think I said this to my producer over the summer. Did I say that to you too, Alex, about the smoking? I was like, I have a theory that because the Surgeon General banned smoking, they are the cause of loneliness in America. So, no, it's not just that. I think there's a lot of things. It's everything that you just said about the culture of masculinity. And it's about the bootstrapping.
That there's that little connecting dots moment.
I will connect it for you.
A lot of us are doing those kinds of ways of thinking. So.
I will connect it for you. So if you look at the statistics of how much suicide has increased over the past 20 years, or how much, and some of that has to do with the fact that there's a lot more in certain states. There's a lot more access to guns and certain kinds of guns than ever before. So you have a lot of things happening at once, right? But there was a time when, right now, I think the national average for smoking is something like 14%. But there was a time when a lot of people smoked, even socially, right?
Yeah.
And if you did that, especially if you did it outside like maybe you and your coworkers, you went out for a break. Like if you didn't speak to anyone all day because maybe you work at like a hedge fund and did hedge funds exist then? I'm sure they did. But like maybe you had 6 screens. You don't have time to talk to people. You go outside for your cigarette break, and you can at least guarantee that 3 times in one day, you're going to have a 10-minute interaction with someone from the office. And you're going to talk about what you're doing this weekend, or, oh, did you see the game, or whatever 5-minute conversation you're going to have 3 times a day. And then that stopped. And I'm not saying that people need to pick up smoking. But if the Surgeon General is saying that
we need little rituals of connection, I agree. That's a very important part. But how do we construct new ones that aren't based on a hyper addiction to nicotine? I don't know.
So hold on. So let me wrap this up for a second.
Okay.
What shocked me was that the Surgeon General said then that loneliness is more dangerous than having 15 cigarettes a day. And I was like, really? That is the analogy that you came up with? You could have said loneliness is more dangerous than like walking across the West Side Highway. I don't know, I'm sure there's some other statistic that exists than like loneliness is more dangerous than you riding your bike without a helmet, or loneliness is more dangerous than you not holding your 4-year-old's hand on the sidewalk. Like there's some other thing could have used, but he used smoking. And I think there's something there. But also, if the Surgeon General is talking about loneliness, okay, what is the government planning on doing?
Got it. Can I give you some insight on why he said smoking?
Yeah.
When you smoke, you exacerbate the likelihood of heart disease, neurodegenerative diseases, all sorts of physical ailments.
Yeah.
When you're lonely, those same physical ailments become much more likely. You have a dramatically higher statistical likelihood of heart disease, of cancer. Cancer metastasizes faster in lonely people. We're talking about a significant, real, measurable impact on health. And I'll give you another piece of data. Why was this not?
Oh my God. Okay. Hold up.
This
is amazing. Okay.
But wait, there's more.
Tell me more.
Niobe Way, in her book, Deep Secrets, says on page 9, she cites a study that was done in Europe with married men and single men in terms of this idea of loneliness creating higher levels of heart disease.
Okay.
Literally killing them earlier in their lives. And what the study discovered was men, women, anyone, if you don't have a circle of meaningful relationships outside your partner relationship, outside your spousal relationship, your heart disease numbers remain dramatically worse. So we as human beings need a circle of meaningful friendships above and beyond that partner relationship. I was talking a little earlier about how men put all that on their wives. Boys get broken away from these close friendships with men, which would emerge, other boys, which would emerge into adult close friendships, that circle of friendships that'll keep us healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, we are then pushed toward girl. You want to express emotionally, you want to have any kind of contact, you want to be with a person, you got to go to a girlfriend. God help a boy who happens to be gay, he's got no solutions there. But ultimately, the health impact of social isolation is dramatic to the point where we are dying earlier because we align with this dominance-based masculine culture. We end up in competition with other men all the time instead of forming close friendships. And I'll tell you a personal story. Can I tell you a personal story?
Absolutely.
This is my men's work, right?
Okay.
I'm over 50 years of age. I've been on this treadmill of manbox culture. I've been making money, getting mortgages, driving nice cars, getting married, getting divorced twice. I keep trying to offer this transactional, performance-based version of manhood, and it's not working in my professional relationships. It's not working with spouses. It's not working with the people in my social circles. I feel disconnected. I feel lost. So I go and do my men's work. What I discover when it's my turn to get on the carpet, which is a moment on the weekend where you stand there and you speak to this group of men and you say, this is where I'm at. What I said in that moment was, based on my childhood, based on the way that I was treated by boys and men over the course of my life, I don't like men. I don't trust men. I hate men. And I'm sick to death of being alone. I'm sick of it. And these men looked at me and they said two things. They said, one, it's not the first time we've heard that from a man here. And the second thing they said was, do you want to trust us? In the intervening years since I made that admission to a group of men who cared enough to say, brother, we hear you, we understand why you feel that way, and we're here to help, that whole picture has turned completely the other way. I love men. I love talking to men. I love connecting with men. The male friendships that I have are so deeply meaningful to me. And if at 2 o'clock in the morning I was having a crisis, I guarantee you I have 5 men, and I have female friends too, who I could call and say, I'm in trouble here. Can you help me? And they would say, yeah. But most men don't have that. Most of us as people don't have that. And it's dangerous. And when the Surgeon General says it's equivalent to smoking, we will actually die earlier from social isolation.
Doesn't that mean that there has to be some government mandate then?
Well, I'll tell you what government can do. Government can mandate, don't ride without a seatbelt. Don't stick a burning mass of tobacco and inhale it. You know, the government can mandate that.
They can't mandate you to
not smoke,
be
but
an
they can say,
incel.
yeah, well,
I'm taking it really extreme.
Well, see, so what we're talking about here instead is,
and that's an extreme example.
What we can do in education. There are there's something called, darn it, I've forgotten the abbreviation, but it's emotional learning in schools. SEL, I think, social emotional learning. Thank you.
Okay.
And these are programs that are being rolled out. They are also being opposed by more conservative state governments. Wish I knew. But social emotional learning is a process by which kids are, and this isn't even relational. This isn't even caring for relationships. My partner Saliha and I, in our book, The Relational Book for Parenting, talk about relational spaces, which is, it's not just my emotions and your emotions. It's what gets created in the back and forth of relating. It's the third space. It's the we. Are we caring for ourselves? Yes. Are you caring for the relationship? Do we know how to care for that? So these ideas of social emotional learning aren't even going that far. They're just saying, if you have an emotion come up for you, can you admit to it and can you name it? Just that simple idea of naming our emotions coming. I feel angry. I feel sad. I feel whatever. When you do social emotional learning, and the data's in on this, studies have been done, grades improve by 11%.
What?
grades, academic performance improves. And the reason is because these young people form better relationships with their teachers. They feel seen, they feel acknowledged because of this social emotional learning, which is threaded through their regular academics. But the other thing they discovered is that teachers are happier in their jobs because there's a human component being added into all of the teaching and telling and learning and testing and priorities that we throw at our kids, right? How often do we have things that we do with our children that invite them to show up as who they authentically are,
Right.
from their emotional spaces, from their relational capacities? And that's the piece that is being mandated in some schools, but which is, I mean, when you talk about an educational system that since Bush's No Child Left Behind became hyper testing focused,
Mm.
teachers are like, look, man, I got to get the grades on these tests or I'm going to be considered a failing teacher. So I don't have
Right.
time for all this stuff.
Right.
But when they finally are convinced to thread some of it in, they find out that they like their jobs better and their students perform better academically.
I'm involved in my community. Like I said, I'm Greek American, so there's like 17 Greek American communities in New Jersey. Such a small state, really organized. And I coach the competitive Greek theater. And I
Oh,
have
nice.
I have 24 teenagers in my group.
Yeah.
And they're all amazing. And when I talk to their parents, and especially when I talk to the teenagers, it's like I feel really privileged to be in this space with them because I get to witness all of them, because it's actually 50-50 in terms of gender breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
I get to witness cross-gender friendships happen.
Mm.
I mean, these kids have all known each other since they were 3. No one's really dating. But it's, they can have that friendship. And then I'm able to follow them. Like now I have kids that started with me when they were in 8th grade. Now they're in college and they're still friends with those people.
That's great.
And it's like, wow, look at you. You're a 19-year-old young man who knows how to make friendships with women and has these strong friendships with the boys that you grow up with. And I just feel like it's like you're already so advanced emotionally just because your parents decided to do this.
More of that, please. One of the things that you're seeing there is happening in a lot of different places. The generation of young men coming up now it's based somewhat on geography where they're located, but boys and men's relational intelligence is increasing dramatically in the younger generations. And I will attribute that to a change in how they were parented, a generational shift, both in terms of how we parent, but also in more engaged fathers.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And this issue of when we talk about considering marriage, considering finding a partner, the issue of engaged fatherhood, some men are ready and want to be engaged in their children's lives. And I, for years, before I got remarried, I was a stay-at-home parent, single parent for my son. I was also earning a living. I was doing all of these things. But I have to tell you, the thing that happened in my life that put me on the path toward a more healthy version of masculinity was taking care of my son. Being in service to a child transforms men. And so few of us get the chance to do it. But once we do it, we discover so many things about ourselves that we never knew existed. Our ability to comfort and care for, our ability to be in connect, to give physical comfort that is not, most men do not have physical relationships unless they are a sexual relationship with a sexual partner. They never get the chance to comfort children until they come into their lives. And then you're holding your son. I have a story of when my son was first born, freaked me right out. This idea that we look at our child and go, oh, angels sing, and where we suddenly understand our mission in the world. It wasn't my experience. My experience was, okay, I'm going to go back to fixing the screen door, and I'm going to go downstairs and do the laundry, and I'm going to do some, just give me stuff to do.
Right.
Because I don't know how to enter into this space at all. But a year later, I'm walking through my house. It's the sun's going down. It's becoming dark. I'm holding him right here. He's starting to fall asleep, and I'm singing to him. Who that man was when that child was first born and who he became because of the call of that child. Come on, come on, come on. Be with me. I'm singing to him, and I used to sing, You Are My Sunshine.
You know what? I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. You know what you're making me think now?
What?
If the government is saying the Surgeon General is saying loneliness, and you're telling me this example of how you felt this because you got to comfort your own child.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's it. The government needs to give paternity leave to all men for the first year.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, the rule in the man box that says be a breadwinner, not a caregiver, points to something very specific. You were talking about the history of medieval women in
Yeah.
medieval culture. The Industrial Revolution took men off the farm where they were there with their children all day, where their whole family was working the farm, and put those men in factories and
Right.
said to those men, we'll give you the economic power in your home, but you got to give us your 12 hours a day or whatever the labor is.
Right.
This created a schism between men and their children, between men and their wives, and set up a culture where men began drinking heavily, doing infidelity, doing all this other stuff as part of man culture in the office, as part of what is essentially retrogressive masculine business culture, which is defined by men and which is now running headlong into DEI efforts, right?
What's DEI?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion
Okay.
efforts in the workplace,
Okay.
where women are saying, we deserve equity, we deserve equal pay, we deserve leadership roles, all that.
Yeah.
This old retrogressive masculinity culture in the business world, those men are completely freaking out in the workplace.
But why? I'm sorry, by the way, I interrupted you before, and I want you to finish that story, and then we'll get back to this. But you were comforting your son
Yeah.
in the room, and then what were you thinking? That
Oh.
how different the two men are that
Well,
you
and
identified
the
with?
idea here is that men in the Industrial Revolution were separated from their children.
Right.
So caregiving became something women did,
Right.
and it became shamed in men. You know, a man's out with his kid. What are you, babysitting?
Oh,
You're not parenting.
dude, I go to conferences right now,
Yeah.
and people are like, "Oh, is George babysitting your kids?" And I'm like, "No, he's parenting them."
He's loving them.
And then they're like, "Do you
And-
miss your kid?" All summer, the 2 weeks I was in Greece,
Yeah.
for a retreat that I was hosting, people got, "Do you miss your kids?" And I'm like, "Not really." Like,
It's
they're
nice to have
they're
a
in
break.
yeah, it's nice to have a break, and
They're
they're
with
in
someone
a
who
safe
loves
place.
them.
Like, yeah, I'm good.
And
No
they're
one would
getting
ever-
time with
No
that
one has
person.
ever asked my husband on a business trip, "Do you miss your kids?"
Right.
Like, I would bet money that no one's ever asked George.
Go to Dad's 2.0 conference for stay-at-home dads.
Oh, that's a conference?
There's 2 million stay-at-home dads in America. They miss their kids when they're at the conference. And they get asked that question. They get asked the question, you miss your kids? Yeah, I kind of do, but this is great. I'm glad to be here. But let's go back to that moment.
Yeah.
I'm holding Gus.
Yeah.
I'm singing to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I'm home finally. I feel like I'm fully arrived
I love that.
in my own experience of myself, of the world. Now, that opened the door to a lot of questions for me about masculinity,
Your own
about
father?
what I was taught about being a man, but also what the world was about to teach him.
Mm.
And that's what led me into a lot of my work around masculine culture and society. Ultimately, you want the answer for not letting dominance-based for that man box culture program your kids, especially your sons. The secret is to be in conversation with them, to relate with them, to talk to them about what's going on for them, to ask them what they think is going on, to invite them into conversations about context, about their own experience of what other kids are doing. Hey, not only that happened between you and him, but how do you think they talk about that at his house?
Mm.
You know, you invite, and that's part of the Relational Book for Parenting. We talk about different ways to grow those conversations. When my son was 6 years old, and he began to have strong emotions that we were like trying to track, I got a big piece of paper out. It's in the book. We drew buttons and pull cords and stuff, and we assigned emotions to him. And we were like angry, happy, hug, yell, you know, whatever things that he wanted to write on there. And we stuck it on the wall. And we got to a thing where we would run over and smack it, and the other person had to do that emotion. Oh, I'm really angry now. And it got to be this thing where we slowly but surely came to understand that we are, in fact, to some degree, able to choose how we express emotionally, right? And plus, the great thing was, you know, if I was starting to get cranky or irritable, he'd run over and hit hug, and I'd be like, ugh, okay,
Oh,
and I'd hug him.
that's
It
so
breaks the
sweet.
patterns of that make emotions seem like they're impossible to confront. They're just too big, and brings them down to a place where we can say, hey, these are all choices we're making. That's
Yeah.
just one little piece of that. We created games and ideas. We had the barking game where if we were in a conversation and we were starting to get heated, and you know, you had a 10-year-old boy, you're going to start debating stuff with him. So we had the parent conference and we're talking to him, you know. And everybody started getting reactive. Anyone in that of those three that wants to start barking like a dog really loud has the right to do that. And it's not an interruption of the conversation. It's an expression of emotion without words attached. And the other people will be like, and we would realize, okay, let's get some of this energy out so we can go back to the
That's
conversation.
brilliant. That's really funny, actually.
These are all just ways to be playful and stay in the emergent nature of those relationships and not tell every kid, we have the power, you don't.
right.
We both have influence in this relationship. There's parts of teaching and telling you have to do. Don't step off the curb into traffic. That's not debatable.
Sure.
But this idea that our children can teach us something about parenting by reflecting back to us what their experience of us is for them, is extremely powerful. So I'm carrying my son. I've learned who I am. I dive deep into masculinity because I want to understand what the world's going to be teaching him. And I come up on all this stuff. Be a breadwinner, not a caregiver. When I take my kid to the park on Wednesday at noon, he's over playing with the other kids. The moms are over there. I'm literally calling, hey, Gus, you need a snack? I'm like signaling that I'm not some weird guy in the park, that one of the kids is
so
mine.
people don't think you're a pedophile
Exactly.
or a sexual trafficker.
Why do we view men that way? You shouldn't be here. These
Right.
are all the expectations of masculinity that stay-at-home dads are throwing off, that engaged fathers are ditching. And there's a guy named Kevin Schaefer. We have a podcast, Remaking Manhood. We interviewed him on our podcast. He's a researcher at Brigham Young University. He's changed jobs now, but he did this whole body of research around engaged fathers and the impact they have on their adult sons. And what he discovered is that engaged fathers' sons are more likely to express emotionally. They're more likely to give and receive caregiving. They're more likely to view women as deserving of equality in political and professional circles, and they're more open to diversity, to a wider range of types of people to be in friendship with. And I asked him, I said, so how old are these men you're talking about? And he said, well, some of their dads were parenting them in the 60s and 70s. And I said, oh yeah, well, what percentage of dads back then were engaged? He said, no. Well, but dads are, to some degree, most of them are in the middle, but really engaged dads, about 15%. And I said, so in the 60s, 15% of dads were teaching their kids about diversity? He said, no, just throwing the ball with them in the backyard, just showing up for their ball games.
15.
I was like,
1-5.
and now what percentage of men are engaged? He said, I don't have an exact number, but it's dramatically higher. And those
Is the engagement though being measured on throwing a ball, or is it like
long and short of it is show up.
right?
Just be there. And when men were in this industrial revolution view of the workplace, they were out with their friends, they were drinking, they come home, read the paper, have a couple of beers, go to bed. They didn't really engage with their children in the way that a father would have on the farm pre-industrial revolution, right?
Right.
So we come forward to this understanding now that there's a wave of young men that are emerging now,
Right.
that are leaning into these
Raised by Gen X and millennial parents.
Yep.
Shout out to us.
Thank you very much. And they are skewing more progressive in their views, which is why you have a Republican Party that's now saying, some in the Republican Party are saying, shouldn't be allowed to vote till you're 25. Shouldn't be allowed to have easy voting access on college campuses, et cetera. Because they see
blows my mind, by the way.
They see the wave coming.
Well, yeah. I just don't even like. President Trump lost by 7 million votes in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about the electoral college. I'm talking specifically like the popular vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a lot of people that are older that may have skewed Republican are dead, after 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I said it like that. And then there's a host of people that have become 18 since then. It's more of those people than those that have died. So
the boomers are no longer the majority of voters.
Right. So it's like, to me, it's like that's 7 million. Like, it's okay. It's nice it's very nice, I suppose, that Donald Trump is the winner and the majority ticket of the Republican Party. I just don't see how they win without, I don't know, voter disenfranchisement. I don't know.
Gerrymandering, disenfranchisement, all that.
All
so, I'm always so wary of going political in these conversations because I really want them to be a conversation about human connection and isolation. That's really what a masculinity conversation comes down to. Are you going to live a life where you're constantly in competition with other men, where you want control over your partner?
It just seems like if a 25-year-old man reads Josh Hawley's book about what a man is and what a woman should be, right? And then you look at the data of like, and what you just said that like, well, look, if you have cross-gender friendships,
Mhm.
and you're able to show your emotion, you're able to comfort people,
Yeah.
like you're able to do all these other things, um, you have a chance of not being lonely or of being in a
Mhm.
relationship. It just seems like, well, why would this is clearly the winner here,
Yeah.
at least in my viewpoint.
One of the
As
things that
someone who's a professional matchmaker who I literally speak to single people all day. That's my entire job.
right.
And I see like what I see, especially in the women that I speak to, right? I remember speaking to Dr. Mir Levine, who wrote the book Attached, and he had said something like 30% of men are avoidant in their attachment style,
Hmm.
which is shocking. And there's a lot of, I've read other works about that corroborate that number, but also like just thinking about like everything you just said, right?
Mhm.
That a subset of men, a majority of men some have been raised in fatherless households.
Mhm.
And then some have been raised by men who did not necessarily participate in the parenting,
Yeah.
right? And so you have this situation where, men are what they are. I'm having a crazy deja vu moment right now. But you have this environment. You
Right.
have this you have this setting of what's happened, right? And I'm just wondering, it's like, okay, if now the new generation of parents that are raising children and maybe more mindful, I suppose, of gender roles and whatnot, um, will we see an increase of secure men over avoidant men?
I believe we will.
Really?
Yes. And I will it's some of this is anecdotal, but I watch my son in relationship with his friends, and he openly says to them, "I love you. I love you, brother." And they say, "I love you." And they hug each other and they talk through their conflicts and they resolve and repair, and they are intent upon keeping these friendships close because they understand how valuable they are. That alone is transformational compared to what boys struggled with in terms of Niobe Wei's research, et cetera. So I believe there is a shift coming in terms of
Well, that's good.
how men view all of this. The other thing that I would suggest is that, um, yeah, my wife's a couple and family therapist, and she deals with couples who are struggling with men's ability to engage in certain ways that women are seeking. And I don't know a lot of details about her work, but she speaks in general ways about the process by which men have to learn to let go of the fears that we have around giving up control, giving up power. And instead of creating power over others,
Mm,
we learn the much richer and truly beautiful experience of creating power with others, creating community instead of hierarchy, right?
right.
And our young sons are already engaging in some of that. They don't my son really isn't that concerned about gender. He's
Right.
like, whatever you are is cool,
Yeah.
because he hasn't been taught that his gender is better,
Right.
that men are inherently better than women. When
Right.
we train boys out of connection,
Mm,
in that what Niobe Way documents, the way we do it is when a boy becomes too joyful, too giddy, too needing a friendship, too emotional, too sad, we say to them, "What are you, a sissy? What are you, a girl?"
right.
And in that moment,
Boys don't cry.
we shame them out of
Mm,
expression, but we're also teaching them that the feminine is less. It's the denigration of the feminine
yeah.
to condition boys out of
I hate
connection.
that. But yeah, you're right.
But what's important to understand is that in that model, we've created a false binary, gender binary, around the full range of human capacities. So boys and men are tough, they're leaders, they play through the pain, they do all that stuff, they never need help. Girls are caregivers and empathetic and
Yeah.
communicators, blah, blah, blah. Right. These are human capacities. They have nothing to do with our sexual identity, they have nothing to do with our gender.
Right.
But we falsely break them into two binaries and strip boys. A, a male leader today in America, in the workplace, in corporations, is being told a simple metric. Yes, you can be a leader. Yes, you can have strong opinions, but you also need to know how to communicate and connect with people different than you. You have to have empathy. You have to have compassion. You have to be able to hold uncertainty and hear the ideas of other people, or you're going to kill innovation in your organization by always thinking you have the answers. This is the full range of being human. And these young men that I've seen in my life, yeah, they do typically male approaches to life, but they also have this compassion piece and empathy piece. So instead of raising girls with one arm tied behind their back, they can't be tough, they can't be leaders, they can't be strong, and raising boys with one arm tied behind their back, they can't be empathetic, they can't be caregivers, they can't find that moment I found with my son walking the floor. We need to raise sons and daughters and non-binary kids who have the full range of being human.
I love that. And that's such a way to perfectly end this episode. Mark, where can people find you?
You can find me at my website, remakingmanhood.com. If you're on social media, that's generally the name I go under. And we have a podcast, Remaking Manhood, the Healthy Masculinity podcast.
And I will include all these links in the show notes. And also, shout out to this book. So I read this book to prep today, the little #MeToo book for men. It's so tiny you can read it, and it's so little, but it's really digestible.
What could possibly be in there? It's just a tiny little
you could
book.
read it in like 45 minutes. Like that's how long it took. And I was just like, and it articulated everything I've ever always kind of thought about and like didn't have the words. So I love this.
It maps the impact of manbox culture.
Mark, this is really amazing. And then you also wrote the Relational Book for Parenting with your partner, Dr. Saliha Bava. This is, I can't wait to go over this with my husband. This looks amazing. Mark, thanks for coming to the Ask a Matchmaker podcast.
I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
And of course, be lovable, but more importantly, be likable. See you next week.